You worked on the global agenda on peace building, transition, fragile states, resilience, disaster risk reduction. He has experience in many different regions of the world, and he has a bachelor's from Georgetown and a master's from University of Chicago. Before I pass the microphone to Jim, I just want to introduce Natalie Brackett, who has very energetically and excitedly joined the INEE team, taking over for Ariana Pacifico, who went back to school. And I'm going to let Natalie introduce herself, and then she'll pass the microphone to Jim. Natalie?
Thanks, Gustavo. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. Really happy to finally meet you via audio. And as Gustavo mentioned, I'm really excited about working with the CSE Learning Community. A few logistical notes, if you could, once you've been able to connect via audio, go ahead and mute your microphone. We had a couple people join via video, but unfortunately I don't think we'll have the capacity for that, so please make sure your video functions are off. We are recording this webinar, and we'll be excited to share it later this week through the INEE channels, and ECCN has expressed their interest in sharing it as well, so we're very excited to promote this and share opportunities for others to learn from our learning community. So with that said, as well, if you have questions during the webinar, Jim has been really encouraging about wanting this to be an interactive experience, so please send those via the chat box. Gustavo and I will be working on curating those and allowing Jim to address those along the way. So thank you so much for your participation, and I will turn it over to Jim. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Gustavo. Thanks very much. I'm very happy to be back in the INEE community. As Gustavo mentioned, I spent several years at UNICEF, and I was leading their peace building agenda as well as some other things. And one of the key areas was collaborating with the education sector on integrating peace building into education programs, and we developed the peace building guidance, and much of that guidance for UNICEF actually served as some of the foundation for the INEE conflict sensitive education guidance, and much of the conflict analysis components that are in the training pack were coming from that UNICEF guidance. So I'm coming full circle a little bit and happy to come back into the INEE community. I have a lot of respect for all of your work. And as Gustavo mentioned, I'm now with, I have my own consulting firm, and I work with USAID's Education and Conflict and Crisis Network. And I wanted to just give you a quick, actually, you know what, Natalie, my sharing is not working. So hold quickly, I'm going to reshare the file. Okay, I think it stopped. So everyone hold for a moment. I'm going to reload it, okay?
Hey, can I ask a question?
Sure, please go ahead.
For those of us that are calling in from the phone, how would you suggest that we can look at your screen as well?
Okay, what I want to do is go over maybe about, if we have 90 minutes, I'd like to take maybe half an hour, and I wince even saying that because I don't like speaking too long and making people listen too long, but about 30 minutes. And then I want to open it up for a good hour's worth of discussion if people can stay that long. And so for that reason, I suggest if you have questions, you can either ask them in the chat function on the right-hand banner, if you see that, or hold your question until I'm through with the presentation. But I recognize the expertise that is on this call. And I patently don't want to give a lecture here. I want to share some of our experience, some of the practice synthesis, and then hear from you, questions and also your comments. Okay? Now, Natalie, I'm still getting the file back up.
All right, Jim, you should be presenter now and able to share that. I don't know how your functions got bumped off.
Yeah. And I'm also having a BBC moment with my younger daughter here, who's very interested in education and conflict and crisis. Let's see here. Now, Natalie, do you want to load this by email, or shall I go back and share it?
You should have the sharing functions now.
All right, I'm going to share it now. Okay, here we go. Let's pull it back up again. Okay, that one's up. Let's pull it up again. Is that coming up? Sorry, still not coming up. Let me try one more time. Or can you upload the one I emailed to you, Natalie? Sorry for the glitch, everyone. Let's do that.
And I can shift through the slides.
Okay. Well, I'll speak. Let me introduce USAID's Education and Conflict and Crisis Network. It's a 5-year initiative that focuses on USAID and USAID's implementing partners that are working on enhancing equitable access in education in conflict and crisis contexts. And it's a community of practice that's dedicated to sharing knowledge, improving practice on enhancing equitable access in these difficult contexts. And it is a 5-year initiative, and it is very much explicitly intended to complement the work of groups and networks like INEE. So it has a USAID focus, but we're actively, as this group shows, we're actively working together with INEE to share lessons and knowledge from our efforts together. We have a number of resources available on our website. If you're not familiar with ECCN or a member, I suggest you join, because there are some very good resources that are emerging through the community. And I'll highlight one or two. One is a Safe Learning Environments qualitative assessment tool, which helps partners go to the ground level and assess the level of resilience of school communities to a range of threats and risks. And it can be done rapidly. It's very useful, and that has helped inform a broader tool called the Rapid Education and Risk Analysis Toolkit, which has been out for a couple of years, and we're about to launch the updated version in a couple of months. And that's a multi-risk situation analysis tool focusing on education, and that involves conflict analysis, but also other risk assessment methodologies. Now, I'll go right ahead, and do I have the ball back, Natalie, or do you want to go and proceed for me? What do you suggest?
Jim, I am sharing the file, so I can click through as you guide.
Go to the next. I just touched on some of the resources, so here they are. They'll be in the website on the PowerPoint that you can save. Next slide, Natalie, please. And from here on, we'll jump into conflict analysis. And like I said, I wanted to go over some of the essential components of conflict analysis, go a little bit deeper in some areas, but I also know that there's a lot of experience here in the group. So I'll model for the middle to begin, and I'll touch on a lot of these slides. I won't delve in too much, but hopefully that will give some thought for discussion after the presentation is over. All right. So conflict analysis, much of this is in the INEE guidance pack. It is the systematic study of conflict, and that means what is the profile of the conflict, the causes, root causes, proximate causes, trends, consequences, who are the people involved, who are the institutions, actors involved, what are the dynamics, especially connectors and dividers. Also, what are the sources of cohesion and resilience? And I want to strike that up front, that even though we call this conflict analysis, you are looking at what are those capacities for peaceful societies and social cohesion as well. So you could call this the conflict and peace building analysis, but the practice has been conflict analysis. Conflict analysis is there and is used to inform action. It's there to inform in the context of the education community, education strategies, planning, programming, whether they're national partners or international partners supporting national partners. It is also the sort of sine qua non basis for conflict sensitivity and peace building. You cannot be conflict sensitive if you have not done a conflict analysis. Most of you might know that, but we have to hit that up front. Next slide. So why do it? The risk of conflict is widespread. I put an asterisk there. And what I mean here is when we use the word risk, it means that all the whole sort of the nature of conflict, the severity of conflict, whether it is latent, active, post-conflict, looking at understanding conflict in all its forms, in all its latency, or in all of its violent, active manifestations. So when you look at it as a risk, whether it is, if it is very latent but improbable, it is still a risk, or if it is like a South Sudan, or if it is a Syria and open and active violence, both of those situations require understanding what are the factors behind potential conflict or current conflict. The asterisk is there because part of my role over at USAID ECCN is the recognition that we're learning more that you don't want to go in to just do only a conflict analysis. Now, this is not going to take away from this whole presentation by any stretch, but do leave the whole presentation thinking about whether you want to do just a conflict analysis or whether you want to look at how, for instance, a school community may be exposed to and weathering risks of all other sorts, whether it is coming from natural disasters, natural hazards, earthquakes, floods, and so forth. That school community will deal with all of those. So why just study one category? More importantly, too, going down the list here, you've heard this before from your conflict-sensitive education workshop in Amman, and you all know this, there's no neutral middle ground. You are part of it. Education is part of the conflict context. That's why it has two faces. You're aware of all that background. It's inherent. It is part of, in a way, it is part of the conflict. It is also imperative that we understand conflict factors in order to prevent harm, and that means it is an imperative. And I like drawing from the humanitarian imperative. My heart goes out to the humanitarian community, but we should try to save lives in advance. It is imperative upon us to do prevention work. Lastly, knowing context better, knowing about all the risks in that context, help us improve our results. That means the results that we can achieve can be sustainable insofar as they're not going to be affected or exposed to unnecessary risks. It also means that conflict analysis is a feedback loop that allows us to be more informed as we design, as we manage programs and projects. And those feedback loops bring us more data and more information, and that can be brought into programs, into adapting those programs, and that also can lead to achieving results and better results. Next slide, please. Now, what it is not, conflict analysis is not a needs assessment. A needs assessment, a humanitarian needs assessment, means that you are looking at the consequences above all. What are the life-saving needs? You are not necessarily looking at what are the underlying causes and drivers and dynamics of the threats that cause the crisis. That's very important. I think they're building it a little bit more. I think the Global Education Cluster has brought in a bit more of the conflict analysis lens, but in general, they look at needs. It is not context analysis, which is quite topical, doesn't look at conflict with any rigor. It is not academic research because it must lead to action. It is not a desk report because you need to get active, current perspectives from people living the reality. And it's not a chronology. Again, that's too topical. And lastly, again, it is not a one-off exercise. You need to time your conflict analysis, tie it to programming moments, and it has to be used. It should not sit on a desk. Next slide, please. Some of the principles behind conflict analysis, again, like we just mentioned before, as education is part of the context, your conflict analysis intervention is part of context as well, so it has to be conflict sensitive as well. You need to draw from diverse local knowledge and information sources. And that diversification of respondents, diversification, the engagement of diverse stakeholders and partners is in itself a conflict-sensitive methodology, but it also helps you improve the quality and validate what you are finding. Gender must be integrated throughout. That means not just the methodology, not just the protocols, not just balanced in all of your respondents and your stakeholders and partners, but also your analysis team as well. Like I mentioned before, it must inform action. And this point here, don't let perfection prevent good enough, and we'll touch on this on the next slide. I've been involved with dozens of conflict analyses, some that have been the Cadillacs, some that have been Fiats, and where we've done the Cadillacs and really have gotten to the grassroots level and had a really rigorous methodology, some people who are not conflict junkies left it thinking that they were exhausted by it. And what we don't want to have happen is non-conflict users or non-conflict specialists like within the education community. We don't want to overdo or seek such a level of rigor that it is not done at all or that it intimidates future use. And I'll move to this, the next slide quickly. These are some of the key, sorry, Natalie, there, you're back again, okay. These are the core elements, and again, these are in the INEE pack, so I'll just touch on them again. The profile situation analysis, don't underestimate this. You'd be surprised how many education sector assessments or situation analyses don't place education in the wider political economy or governance context. You have to place education in its realm of power relationships, and that is very important. The next three are really the stuff, sort of the critical elements of a conflict analysis. Causal analysis, why is the conflict happening? What is driving it? From structural factors up to more proximate triggers. Stakeholder analysis, very important. Who's involved? What are their relationships? Who are they? What are their capacities? What are their interests? What are the positions they take? And lastly, the dynamics. We speak of dynamics all the time, but let's break that down. That means, what are the relationships between the conflict factors, relationships between the factors and the stakeholders, what brings communities together, what tears them apart, the connectors and dividers, which is, some people would argue, the very most important part of conflict analysis is understanding connectors and dividers. That is what you use as the basis for your conflict sensitivity. And understanding the sources of peace building, capacities for peace building, sources of resilience, and also what are the conflict trends. What will the conflict look like in 5 years from now? If you're going to program, you do need to have some sense of scenarios in the future. Next slide, Natalie. Now, bringing it into the education realm a little bit, to the degree that the education community has been bringing the conflict analysis practice into its own tools and methodologies, it is there's good work being done, and you're seeing that the practice is centering on four main categories of the relationship between education and conflict. And again, I think you know this, how conflict impacts education, how education contributes to conflict, how education can be resilient to conflict, and then the contributions of education to peace building. And by resilience of education to conflict, what are the coping strategies of school communities? In some of these areas, South Sudan, Syria, what are teachers doing to be able to continue teaching? What are learners doing who are suffering so much violence? How are they able to handle, emotionally manage that violence so that they can actually learn? So some nods here to the work on social emotional learning. Next page. Now, this came up in my conversations with Gustavo, and this comes up an awful lot in my work with USAID, the USAID community, USAID ECCN. What is good enough? And I reveal my colors. I'm an advocate for good enough, but as long as people know explicitly up front what you're heading into. It first has methodological meaning. You need to. And someone should mute. I'm hearing some background noise. It doesn't really bother me, but it might bother others. The methodology must have a sufficient systematicity. You need to draw from and argue why you have, let's say, a purposive sample, primary data collection sample. The findings must be rooted in data. Your questions, your protocols must be well developed, and that your findings must be very much tied to the actual data and your conclusions and recommendations similarly must be tied to the data coming from that purposive sample. And more importantly, where you have limitations, you need to state this up front in your final report. So this is a key part of good enough. Your readers of the final report of the conflict analysis must understand exactly what you did, exactly where those limitations were, and be precise about that, so they know that what they're getting. I would highlight a few other points, and this is also based on lots of other lessons learned from the community. It has to be participatory, and World Vision here has been very strong in this regard too. You have to have local participation from senior partners, duty bearers, Ministry of Education, down to teachers, parents, local communities. They need to be involved in this whole process at every stage, and in different ways, but at every stage. That is both to ensure conflict sensitivity, as I mentioned before, but it also helps ensure that where you make trade-offs and rigor, that these mechanisms are sort of quality control, risk management measures, just so that you can, the integrity, the systematicity of your process is good, your final results are of quality and are accurate as well. I would say a good enough conflict analysis, and CDA has said this as well in the past. CDA, if you're not aware of them, they're some of the strongest organizations in conflict analysis. You need to really do the analysis of the conflict. Sometimes I've seen conflict analyses where they really don't ask the questions of why the conflict is happening. What are the dynamics? What are the connectors and dividers? What are the grievances and the sources of cohesion? That has to come through the conflict analysis. If you do not have that, you do not have a conflict analysis. And lastly, all of these efforts, all of your methodology doesn't matter if your final report is not readable, usable, well-honed, and readable by a very busy audience. So we'll touch on this later when we talk about the team, but the final report has to be quality, otherwise it's going to fall on deaf ears and it's not going to be used. Next. Wanted to do a conflict analysis. I'll just touch on this. On the first paragraph here, context, I've talked about this, active or post-conflict or latent, all of them, because conflict is something that can happen anywhere. Interestingly, many conflict analysis specialists are honing their sights on the United States for whatever reasons that might can be grabbing their interest right now. Anywhere it can happen. So again, think about understanding deeper structural unseen factors that could potentially lead to outbreak of violence. There is a prevention imperative that we have. National planning moments. Here, I'm pulling only 2 bullets out of what is a very complex reality. Wherever you have national development plans that are occurring that use context analysis as their starting point, that's where you need to bring in the lenses of conflict analysis. So here you have national development plans, poverty reduction strategies, peace building priority plans. All of those often do, not enough, but often do use conflict analysis. And education sector diagnosis should, as one example, use conflict analysis. Bringing it into the sort of world, the reality of an organization, NGO or UN partner in your program cycle. This is important because if you don't time your conflict analysis with those entry points in your program cycle, it may fall on deaf ears, it's not going to be used, or it might get out of date, given how rapid these environments can evolve. So program planning and design, situation analysis, pre-design as the case may be, mid or post-program, monitoring and evaluation, consider feedback loops, or a rolling or ongoing conflict analysis that can be regularly updated. So almost anywhere, I wouldn't say anytime. Here you really have to pay attention to the entry points. Next page. Okay, now process overview. This means for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to sort of hang these pieces of conflict analysis on these main phases of a normal sort of situation analysis or situation assessment. And I don't want to nitpick about the titles here. I can move data collection earlier or design earlier, but let's run with this for now. So I want to sort of bring these pieces of conflict analysis that are often described out in sort of hanging by themselves, bring them into a sort of a system or a structure that you may know well. So next slide. Under planning, let's talk about the conflict analysis team, bringing in a team. The size can vary tremendously. You can have a minimum team, or you could have a considerable team with lots of enumerators in the field, but there are some ingredients that have to be there. First, you need local expertise, local representation, local knowledge. Now, that doesn't mean everyone on the team has to be local, but you must have that in strength. Secondly, gender balance. Absolutely has to be a gender balanced team for a number of reasons you all know very well. You need to have a conflict specialist, someone who knows conflict analysis. It may not be good enough just to be a peace builder who's run programs. You need someone who knows the questions to ask and who's got experience in doing conflict analysis. And of course, you need your sector specialists. You need someone who preferably knows qualitative research. Conflict analysis is heavily qualitative research, open-ended questions and so forth. So someone who can, sort of mind the quality of the methodology is very important. Skill and sensitive facilitation. To the degree that your analysis is going to be hosting, organizing, focus group discussions, even key informant interviews on these sensitive topics, you need someone who is a very skilled facilitator. And this is a very important note for those moments where you may want to contract enumerators that might be very good at quantitative exercises and entering data, but enumerators, field personnel going out as the fingertip of your exercise, they really must know how to handle these situations. And it is not following a protocol. It is how do you behave? How do you manage risk? How do you uphold ethics when things go south? And so, so skilled facilitation is important. Cohesion under pressure. The team must be able to work together. And this is another conflict sensitivity lesson. If you have an international or an international national team, they're ostensibly to represent the peace building future, let's say, of a country, and they cannot work together. That does not help. It doesn't help. More than that, you're not going to be able to meet timelines and uphold quality if the team cannot work together. So people must work together. Lastly, a politically adroit team leader. The conflict analysis is political. It is political, not just because it's dealing with sensitive topics, but you need to, and I'll touch on this later, you need to deal with a range of stakeholders who may be parties to the conflict, who have strong views, and you're dealing with divisions in society, and you need to reach out and manage communications, messaging, and relationships throughout the entire exercise. So this is the responsibility above all of the team leader. Lastly, my asterisk on the right, no matter how good your tool is or your methodology, nothing's going to replace the quality of your team. It all boils down to the individuals, to the humans on that team. Next slide. Planning phase again. Team self-assessment, the conflict sensitivity self-assessment. I wanted to bring this forth because this isn't always discussed in conflict sensitivity training or in conflict sensitivity conversations. It's very important your team does a self-assessment. Once it comes together, if it's a partner that's hired it, or if they're even staff pulled from within a big organization, make sure your composition is right, like we just discussed it. Expose and surface and discuss frankly and honestly what your biases and prejudices are. Everyone has them. We all enter these contexts with biases, with prejudices. We need to discuss them and make them explicit. You all have to, I'm assuming you're all going to do a conflict analysis already. Do you see how confident I am on that? People on the team must know context. You're not starting from scratch. You hire people with expertise and who know context. And if some of the internationals who may come into the team do not know as much as locals, foster a conversation, make sure they get up to speed because they have to be conflict sensitive as much as possible. Experience and sensitive facilitation, make sure that's covered. And then again, political adroitness, make sure that that's covered as well. And this also applies not just to what might be your core team, this applies to any subcontractors or enumerators that you contract. Next page. Okay, setting parameters, like any situation assessment. Here, where do you look? It depends on the conflict, depends on the nature of your education program. Is it system strengthening, capacity development, advocacy at national levels? Or is it something that looks at building the resilience of school communities where you have to get down into the grassroots level? Your operating environment, is it permissive, non-permissive? Where can you go? Where can't you go? Lastly, the last 2 points, existing conflict analysis, don't repeat whatever's been done. Perhaps there's been a lot done in a certain country, and that can help you refine the scope of what you're looking at. And then lastly, political sensitivities. I'll touch on this on the next slide. typically, you know, in the open or open conflict, active conflict countries, or countries where you're going to see real severe divides and inequalities, you're going to have a strong voice from your national governmental partners, and or others, as the case may be. The language you use and the notion of doing a quote, you know, conflict analysis in that country will not be fondly thought of among the political interlocutors. So you have to find other ways to adapt to what you're going to do. Next page, next slide. So here's the first sort of some suggestions for how you can adapt a conflict analysis. And some of this, you know, some of you may see this and recognize this slide from, we do this in our RERA work at USAID ECCN. This is just to show all the different kinds of adaptations in scope that you can pursue with a conflict analysis or any situation analysis, as the case may be. Minimum, if you can't get out anywhere, South Sudan, start with a desk review, maybe some remote primary data collection as the situation unfolds or improves. You can then increase the size of the footprint, increase the size of your primary data collection sample. So here, just in terms of parameters, you have options for your primary data collection. Really, that's going to be the one issue that's going to expand or contract depending upon a non-permissive environment. Next slide. And here, terminology, and this came up a lot in the MENA region when I was at UNICEF, and I was training people doing the same training on conflict analysis in UNICEF, and terminology mattered a lot. We spent a long time, an entire day, just on looking at the terminological options we had for the words conflict, for the words peace, and many options did come up, and of course, we're talking about local translations. Other words you can consider are resilience, risk, social cohesion. You can do a conflict analysis without using the conflict word. Research questions, your methodology, you have other ways you can adapt your methodology. We'll get into questions in a moment, but here you can shift the emphasis a little bit from the bad, who's behind the conflict, why is it happening, so forth and so on, to a bit more of an appreciative inquiry where you're looking at how people are getting by. Where are those sources of cohesion, resilience factors, capacities, and assets, which in your focus group discussions or key informant interviews, you start there, and depending upon your relationship, if you're there on the ground long term and you have relationships, your interlocutors may then ease up, and then you can speak about the bad side, so to speak. But this can help you get in the door with difficult national partners. And again, remember, engaging a diversity of partners and stakeholders at all levels will help you understand what might be your options. Okay, next slide. I'm going to quicken the pace a little bit. So I'm not going to go through all these. I have 2 or 3 slides of illustrative questions. These are not the questions you have to ask, but they're here to give you a flavor for what a conflict analysis, you know, what the main research questions can look like and what some of the specific questions can look like. So here are 4 overarching conflict analysis questions that relate to an education sector and conflict analysis kind of assessment. So, you know, you've probably seen these before: a broad question getting into the nature of conflict, understanding conflict, two-way interaction, and then also appreciative inquiry. Where do we see opportunities to capitalize on what might be going well? What are the coping strategies? Where are there assets and capacities that we can build upon? Okay, and those guide the overall analysis. Then on the next slide, you'll see sub-questions. Nathalie, thanks. Again, examples of sub-questions that can be part of your methodology. Causes, what divides people, trends, who are the main actors, how does the education sector promote social cohesion, who is most affected, how is school safety affected. So you're going down in terms of degrees, in terms of specificity, and even this, some of these you might be able to use for a focus group discussion, but you would still need to adapt these considerably, get more specific. And then very importantly, this all must be translated into local languages. This is in English right now. This all has to be translated and make sense in a local language. You'll get to the point where you'll translate these, and it's really more than translation. You'll have to find the right meaning, and then you'll be translating it back into English, as the case may be, depending upon your organization for internal purposes at times. So local involvement in adapting all these questions is paramount. Next slide. Here are some examples of focus group questions that you could ask. And you'll see some similarities, but they're getting a little bit more specific, looking at who is in school, who's out of school, why do people turn to violence, what support might be needed from the ministry. And this is a focus group that you would hold perhaps in a school community. It could be with teachers, it could be with, some of these might be appropriate for students, it could be for community members. All right. What would your community look like in 5 years? That might help you develop some scenarios for future programming. All right. What support do you receive from parents and families? And that's a very important question to ask in these high-risk environments. Next slide. So as you go through your design, you'll design your research questions like you normally would do, and then you look at your secondary data sources. And some of these you'll know, they're familiar: education sector data, your EMIS data, national household surveys, your mix. This aggregation here is important. The key thing to look at here above all is identity group, and you can break that down by different identity group characteristics, whether it is language, whether it is religion, whether it might be associated with a geographic region. And then going down the list, you'll want to look at other conflict analyses that have occurred. Look at disaster risk assessments. Vulnerabilities will overlap there. That's important. Humanitarian needs assessments, country analyses, political, economic, social, World Bank assessments. Academic research plays an important part, and news reports and analyses. These are intuitively pretty obvious, I know. Next page. Stakeholders and informants here. What might stand out a little bit from who might be your key stakeholders and potential informants? Stress that you have to reach out to the peace and security, peace building community. That's vital. You have to speak with them. Religious leaders, civic leaders, political leaders. These are people that you would normally talk to in other kinds of situation analyses. But you need to make sure that you reach out to a diversity of informants, because people are going to have different views about why the conflict is happening, the situation in the country, and you need to get that diversity of views. Let's see. Okay, yeah, well taken. A note to slow down a little bit, happy to do so. Next slide. Stakeholder engagement here. Remember, a conflict analysis is political. I frankly think that any situation analysis in any of these countries is political, but especially a conflict analysis. Now, in terms of the stakeholder process, after you've developed, you've done a bit of design, you've set your parameters broadly, and let's say the team comes together in country, or if you're already there, the team comes together. Once you have enough of an idea of what your objectives are and parameters, you need to reach out. And before you really start data collection, or as you start data collection, or as you start your desk review, you need to hold early briefings with all the key actors at least national capital level if you can't go subnationally. And that's extremely important to apprise them of what your intentions are, what's happening, and especially for the Ministry of Education. They're the duty bearer of most of the recommendations that you may come up with. And you need to keep that communication channel going. You'll need to both provide them with information, and you must solicit information back from these stakeholders on your proposed methodology, your parameters, and so forth. So this is the relationship management and communication that must happen throughout all steps of a conflict analysis. Also, some very concrete coordination on logistics and preparing for primary data collection site visits. A number of considerations come up in those conversations, starting off with safety and security, and that is both not just for your conflict analysis team, but for the informants, especially children and adolescents and youth. I'll touch on this later, but in the context of U.S. partners receiving federal funding, you need to follow strict ethical guidelines. You may need to submit what's called an internal review board submission to make sure you are following agreed standards on agreed ethical standards for research on human subjects. And I cannot stress this enough, because you're talking about a conflict. You're talking about people who are vulnerable, and again, this is different than a humanitarian needs assessment. Here, you're going to be talking about why the conflict is happening. It is more intense. It can be more provocative and incendiary at times, and so coordinating on setting up very assiduously those primary data collection visits, whether it's a focus group or key informants, whether it's at the school, community level, teachers, students, how you get approvals and consent forms. That's all very important, and you begin that with, at the national level, talking with the Ministry of Education. Next slide. Data collection approaches. These things you know very well. I'll only focus in, again, on the need for skilled facilitation, key informant interviews at any level. Focus group discussions also can happen at any level, from school community level, in the school, out of the school. Subnationally, if you want to pull together what might be sort of like a regional group of Ministry of Education line, directorate, staff. We in other countries, we've pulled staff out of where they were geographically into the capital where it was logistically easy to do, and had focus groups there. Again, you want to make sure that you have gender balance. You would, as any other sort of research or situation analysis, separate, you know, girls, young girl adolescents from boys. Make sure you have a good representation, balance of women in teacher focus groups, or separate them. So be very mindful of gender throughout the entire process. Surveys are sometimes used as well, where you have non-permissive environments. New technologies are also really being discussed these days. They're more discussed in the context of early warning and preparedness than conflict analysis. Again, conflict analysis is getting into why is this all happening and who's doing what and why, not just where is something happening, who needs help now, and so forth. U-Report that UNICEF began, which I'm a big fan of that work, does offer a bit more of a wider platform to have more of a discussion, which is useful. But just to say that I do not pretend to be an expert on the new technologies in conflict analysis, but you know, here you might want to talk to ICT specialists to see what options there are. Just be very careful about conflict sensitivity when you want to introduce something remote and something technological. Next slide. Now, here are an example of focus group participants, something that you would normally think of as well. Again, same considerations apply, gender, ethics. You can also, we found it's important, under community members and organizations at the local level, you can break that up in different ways depending upon the community. Sometimes partners will be in the community member focus group discussions. These considerations, these very sort of tactical decisions about how you structure your focus groups and who comes in and who are the respondents, it's very important to discuss this with local actors, and more than one local actor, principals, directors, school directors, organizations, international organizations, or NGOs, local NGOs that are active in the community. All that very, very fingertip current local knowledge is extremely important. So laying the groundwork is very important to fine-tune all of this approach. Next slide. Oh, one other thing I wanted to mention as well, which is that, again, I think it might be a standard for some of your work already, but when you're doing focus group discussions, you'll want more than one person from the, more than one facilitator from the conflict analysis team. Be mindful of gender. Women should interview girls. Be mindful of how you take notes, whether you're using a computer, whether you're doing, you're taking notes on a notebook, whether you're taking notes on a flip chart. People feel insecure. Oftentimes people will feel very reluctant to speak. So all the body language, how you take notes, the whole process, and the language you speak, who's the ethnic identity or the identity group representation of your facilitators, all of that has to be taken into consideration. Now, stakeholders, another step, another sort of regular component of a conflict analysis, stakeholder analysis. You'll usually, there are different ways that partners and their tools will map and profile who are the main actors involved or who have a stake in the conflict. You'll generally want to look at their characteristics, what's the nature of that actor or individual, what are their positions and needs. And people, I think I'm sure you understand this. This is important. What people say publicly in a meeting, that's what their stated position is. That may be different than what their real need is. So understanding conflict, what drives them, what their fears are, their needs are, that's where you really sort of want to go. You have to know what their positions are, but what are their real interests and needs, and that can reveal opportunities for action to build peace. Capacities, what kind of capacities do they bring to bear? How much do they influence the conflict or the situation in the country? The case may be in your data collection methodology, you may speak to you may have one outlier response as an individual or an organization in terms of their take on the conflict, but if they have undue or if they have a considerable influence over the overall process, that's an important outlier to pay attention to. Lastly, relationships and dynamics, systems thinking. You have to start telling the story, weaving it together. Who is in alliance with whom? Who is in opposition with whom? Who is in conflict with whom? Where is there no relationship? Where should there be a relationship? Who is there as an actor for social cohesion? Who is not? You know, laying this out visually is very helpful. So I'll give you a few examples here. I won't explain them, but you'll just see just visually how they can differ. Natalie, next slide, please. Standard stakeholder analysis taken from Nepal. Your four categories, your 4 columns: characteristics, interests, needs, positions, and capacities. This is of one of the parties to the conflict, the Maoists here, and hopefully it comes through clear enough. Let me ask you, Natalie, can you see this clearly enough? It was good on the widescreen. I have my screen minimized. Okay. This is one way that you can do it, and you'll see the degree of detail that you really need. It doesn't need to be an academic exercise. Again, this is to inform action and to understand what this actor is about. Next slide. This is an example of a stakeholder map where you start visually assigning sizes to the weight or the influence or the capacity of the actor, and you start drawing the lines to identify the relationships. And you can codify or the lines any way you want, but they're intuitively clear. Broken lines means in conflict. 2 green lines means they're in alliance. No line means they have no relationship, and so forth. So this can actually be helpful when you want to sort of map out who's involved in the conflict. Next slide. Now, we're getting into the root cause discussion. This is very interesting. You will have seen this before, the iceberg example, where the Titanic is sailing along and sees the tip of the iceberg, but it's really down below where the majority of the berg really exists. And this is to give you the idea that understanding conflict is driven by a number of factors that are structural or that are root, that are more intermediate, and then the triggers are the events that we tend to see. The triggers are the riots, the triggers are the attacks. Those are arriving and happening due to other deeper factors. And the conflict analysis is what gets you under the water. I'll give you another example. The iceberg could equally be, next slide, a volcano. This is from World Vision, and I think this actually tells the story a little bit better than an iceberg. And here you see how they have the underground, the seismic activity, which are the structural causes. The intermountain are the trends and patterns that are emerging from the structural causes, and then the smoke and ash, the events that we just discussed. Now, structural causes, what are we talking about here? In conflict, junkie conflict, and peace-building community speak, your structural causes can be termed structural violence. Deep-rooted, long-standing, institutionalized discrimination, inequalities in terms of, for instance, access to education, inequalities that overlap with identity group, that can then begin driving identity group grievance. Nigeria, one example with massive inequalities, also regionally based. Poorly functioning institutions, governance, lack of political participation, human rights abuses, long-standing sense of injustice. These are what drive grievance and over time and ultimately can produce violent conflict. And this is why when you look at the iceberg and you look at the volcano, why I would encourage anyone to look at any development context and not find issues such as simmering inequalities, any of the grievances, democratic institutions or other forms of governance that are not functioning to the expectations of a certain identity group. You're always going to find it. So that's why I say you don't just have to be at the top of the volcano with lava flowing down to do a conflict analysis. You just have to understand that it's a volcano. Next slide. Another tool that you use is the problem tree, where similar to the volcano and to the iceberg, you have root causes, a main conflict problem, as we say. It could be any main problem, any main conflict in a setting, and there's usually more than one conflict in a given country. And then the manifestations or consequences, and I'll give you an example of one of these that has been carried out. Next slide. And this helps you or your partner again, draw the lines between, it's not really strictly cause and effect, but begin to understand what are the underlying factors, the relationships between some of those underlying factors, and how those can create a pathway to violent conflict. And this is an example from ethnic tension in Burundi, again from CDA. This is quite well done. I'll leave that there for a moment. I'll expand my own slide here. So you see colonialism, long-standing issues, manipulation of history, economic marginalization, inequality, leading to ethnic tension. Manifestations are displacement, forced displacement, impunity, injustice, sexual violence. And these are just tools in the conflict analysis box that help the RERA team analyze their data, organize their data. And in many conflict analyses that are supporting explicit peace-building initiatives, you will do some of these exercises within a focus group or a workshop, for instance, and you can imagine the skill you need to do this, but that does happen. Next slide, please. Okay, analysis, actors, dynamics example. This is taken from USAID's conflict assessment framework. This is where they begin tying together your analysis of stakeholders and actors with what they identified as certain key lines of inquiry or categories of conflict drivers, where you've got history, physical and geographic characteristics, institutions, grievances, resilience, key mobilizers. So that's how USAID has organized some of their thinking about conflict causes and drivers. And then also they have on the right columns, facts, feelings, and forecasts. These are what come through in your qualitative open question methodology when you're doing a conflict analysis. And again, another way to organize your analysis, organize your data in a logical framework. Let's see here. Next slide. Now, as the conflict analysis team does its analysis and starts producing, preliminary findings, here again is an important moment to reach out and consult stakeholders, consult partners. Again, you want to make sure that your preliminary findings are accurate, they're robust, and you also do not want to release surprises to your community of partners on the topic of conflict. So you hold validation meetings with partners, and again, here it is, you present your methodology, your preliminary findings, conclusions, and recommendations if you've gotten that far, and you allow them the opportunity to give input. Now, some of these people most likely would be the people that you met with initially for your inception briefings as you began the conflict analysis. Here you bring it back to them to say this is what you found, and it's very important. And even if no one disagrees with you, that itself is very important. But this will help you, back to a good enough conflict analysis. This is one of those measures that helps you find that, that level of sufficiency in your methodology and in the quality of your findings and final report. This helps you get there. It also helps you manage sensitivities and risks, because these are the people, many of them, again, Ministry of Education, that will be responsible to take forward recommendations. So it improves legitimacy, quality, and accuracy. It also can help you start, laying the groundwork for partners who may have a role in taking action on some of the recommendations. Next slide. Now the final report, now this is not too unique to conflict analysis, and some of you have heard me speak to this before. Again, if your final report is poor, it undermines the entire conflict analysis investment. This is the final product. You don't want it too long, you don't want a data dump, you want something that can be read, and you want to carry out what we call data synthesis. Synthesis for headline conclusions. You have to tell the story. You want a busy person to be able to read what your main conclusions are from your findings and read them in a straightforward way to make sense of volatile, complex environments. And if you know this very well. I used to deal with very busy people back in my UN UNICEF days, reps and others who would not have the time to go beyond a page and a half in terms of headlines. And if you lost them, they would not want to really read more. So you need to have that writing skill on the team to draft strong headline conclusions, easy to read, tell the story. And as you do your analysis as well, make sure to highlight where there are some cross-sectoral dependencies. You can think of many, from WASH to local governance and so forth. And then lastly, your recommendations must be actionable. They have to be actionable. They must be drafted and crafted and tailored to the institutions that can take action in a way that they'll understand it. Next slide. And I think here, these are some resources. There's some resources that were very usefully put in the INEE guidance pack in terms of conflict analysis tools. Some of these might be a little bit of an update on that. CDA has some very good tools. USAID has done very good work from their conflict assessment framework, also integrating conflict and fragility analysis into education sector work. Down through partners, UNESCO, World Vision, Search for Common Ground, and even the World Bank on resilience. There's some very good work out there in terms of tools that you can use. And lastly, I would say I'm aware of most of you that have signed on, some of your organizations. Most of you have some strong peace-building conflict analysis colleagues in-house, including tools and methodologies. So I just want to give a nod on some of those people that I know. So I'm humbled here to speak to this in front of you, and with this I'll close, and went a little over time, but we've got hopefully half an hour for questions, and I'll try to minimize my screen so I can see the rest here. Thank you very much for your patience in listening.
Thank you so much, Jim. That was excellent. I can already hear people clapping all over the world. And we are going to open it up for questions. You can pose your questions on the chat room. I know that not everybody is very familiar with the way this works, but on the top of your screen on the right hand, you have an icon that says chat, and you can go on that, click, type your question on the box, make sure that it's sent to everyone, or at least to INEE and or myself. So you can ask your question there. If you have a microphone, raise your hand and we can give you the word. We just want to make sure that is, because people are located everywhere, I want to make sure that people don't don't talk at the same time. So let me see if there are any hands raised.
I see one of the sources already being shared, Marco, World Vision. That's a very good book, and you also have a very strong peace-building team in World Vision. Matt Scott's a friend. We work a lot together. He's very good, so you're in good hands with him.
I actually have a question while we wait for others to ask questions. I have a question for you, Jim, and this varies obviously from context to context, but at least in places like Central America, and I know you were recently in El Salvador, the issues related to a conflict are very intertwined with law enforcement and the justice system, mostly because the type of violence that happens relates to gangs and sort of urban crime and violence, as opposed to sort of a separate separatist group, et cetera. So how, and I think you mentioned in one of your stakeholders. So can you speak about whether you have any experience or any advice in terms of engaging this sector, which is typically operates very differently than the education sector, and sort of the word prevention is not always there. So any insights as to working with law enforcement officials?
Yeah, thanks, Gustavo. It's a good point. And as I began, sort of adapting a traditional conflict analysis presentation, a bit more for the education community, the short answer is yes, you should talk, not work with, but you should talk to all actors that have a stake in, let's say, violence or criminality or conflict, as the case may be. The issue is going to be getting the right people on the team who have networks, who know the country, surfacing biases, just to know who they know, why they know those people and not other people, and reaching out early on as you're doing, maybe even before your desk review or during desk review, to find data, and then as you do key informant interviews, getting the right people to interview. We did this in El Salvador, and it took some time to really network to find the right people. And the point here would be, yes, talk to them. You in a conflict analysis, if it's a peace building initiative, and conflict analysis is often used for peace agreement negotiations or other kinds of mediation, where you will talk to all parties to a conflict. If you have to manage your perceptions, the perceptions of you in doing it. So you have to get the right people, and you also need to make sure that you diversify your informants, so that if you would not go into an El Salvador, obviously, and just only speak to the police. You would want to speak to communities. You would want to speak to people who might be critical of the police. You would want to get the full wide range of views. And then part of the skill that you need on your team will be then when you do these validation meetings. And the question arises, well, then would you invite police into the same workshop with other actors? Is that intelligent? The people who you may bring together in the workshop, you have to be careful of. And there's no recipe that I would say now at the global level. It is all locally informed. So your local expertise will help you make those sensitive decisions. But yes, reach out to them. Their perspectives on violence as a main duty bearer for preventing and responding to violence is fundamental. But how you go about doing it requires research, it requires tact, it requires networking, and some skill in the sort of the day-to-day management of how you speak to them, how you're seen speaking to them, who else you speak to, and so forth. Is that helpful?
It is. Thanks. Sorry, I was on mute. Yes, it is. Thank you.
And one more thing I would add, which is conceivably, you would, I can imagine all sorts of moments when, if you're doing a violence assessment, the question would arise whether you should talk to the gangs. And the point there is, this came up in El Salvador. There might be moments and reasons why, depending upon who you are as an institution and so forth, whether you can or you cannot speak to gangs, but the nature of gangs is such that the voices of gangs will come through just because they tend to pervade at the community level at times as well. So there you would have these two respondents, so to speak, these two informants. On one hand, you would have police. On the other hand, you would have gangs. But that is what enriches your analysis. But how you message that, how you write about that, and how you produce a finding with that data and do that analysis is another important step. That's a very locally informed thing.
Thank you. And there's a question there from Andrea, who's asking. He had to step out for a minute, but he was asking whether you can share real life, and you share one example of the Nepal example, but if you have any other good enough quote unquote conflict education analysis to be shared with a group.
Well, I can't speak. No, I will speak personally. I can't speak on behalf of USAID or even ECCN. But I would say two exercises come to mind. That one, there was a conflict, a community, CECA, what was it called again? Creative Associates did this for USAID in Nigeria, and it was a community conflict assessment, a CECA, carried out, I think, in 2015 in northern Nigeria, which I would say probably it might be better than good enough, but it's useful to see different conflict analysis reports, and to the degree they did their homework and they wrote it well and they explained their methodology, and you can check out their sample and so forth, that will give you a sense of what might be relatively rapid, what might be relatively more rigorous. So I would check out that report, and if Andrea, you link with Gustavo, I get your email, I can share a few others. That's one. Look at the RERA that we did in El Salvador, which was officially seeking to be good enough and rapid, and we laid up front what the trade-offs were in terms of methodology. That was not a conflict analysis, but like I mentioned before, it was a methodology that built in conflict analysis with disaster risk analysis and resilience analysis. That's up on the USAID ECCN site. Again, the El Salvador RERA, and I can think of a few others. And I would suggest on the ECCN site also, there's a host of summary conflict analyses from UNICEF's work on their peace building and education program. There are about 10 or 12 conflict analysis summaries. Now those are summaries, and they may not have gotten into the methodology, but that's a nice resource to look at. But I'm happy to try to find a few others that might satisfy that sort of good enough criterion. I hope that helps, but let's be in touch also bilaterally, okay?
Great, Jim, and yes, we can share some of those. We'll try to find some of those resources and share with the learning community in our portal. We had Julia Finder from Creative, but I think she had to leave just a few minutes ago, which I saw her on the list of participants. There are yes, Marco. So Marco had the question where we can include this reference. We will include those resources, Marco. Thank you. One of Susanne asks, or sort of a comment that more than an actual conflict in Jordan, the crisis revolves around refugees. So it's not necessarily a conflict, but it's a crisis, and their methodology has to be adapted. Can you speak to that? When in context of not necessarily an active conflict, but some sort of emergency or crisis, how do you adapt some of these? How can some of the tools and processes that you have described can be used for contexts like Jordan?
Sure. Yeah. No, that's a very good question, and it depends on if there is already, let's say, some sort of an assessment planned. You need to get a hold of that tool, so to speak. It depends on who the organization is, what their methodology already is, and there are ways that you can theoretically, let's say, bureaucratically is another issue, but theoretically you can bring in some of the key elements of conflict analysis into that other, let's say, education assessment. And there, what I would say is you want to, again, prioritize things. You want to prioritize, and it focuses on your key questions, or if the assessment uses indicators, there can be indicators as well. But it depends on the key questions you choose. And frankly, I've done this so many times, it really depends on, your relationships, in that organization, that office. How many questions can you bring in? How much influence do you have over that methodology? Maybe you get 3, 4, or 5 questions in. Then how else can you shift that process? I would say always jump in. If it's, let's say, a humanitarian needs assessment kind of tool, jump in, start the conversation, find out where there is room to move, bring in someone else in who can maybe backstop you and help you from the conflict analysis specialist kind of lens to really prioritize what are those questions that you need. So I have too many questions myself about what you might be facing in terms of the tool or approach that's going to be taken. Just encourage you to say, yes, jump in. I'm happy to talk bilaterally with you if you don't have a sort of a conflict analysis specialist or peace building team in your organization. And I think that, yes, I think some of the questions about conflict or resilience and all of that are highly relevant for Jordan, especially for the refugee settings. Absolutely. So if I can help further, I can. I'm sorry to have to hedge on the answer. I have too many questions, really, but yes, it's very relevant. And you don't have to use the conflict analysis word. Again, massage your language. Some people react very negatively to using the conflict word. There are other words you can use. You can use resilience. You can use risk. You can use cohesion. Just finding what those questions are. And again, remember, it's ultimately going to be translated. And so finding what those words and language are, and get those, through the system, so to speak, as long as you know what you need to ask.
Thank you, Jim.
I see a question over here. Go ahead.
I'll
defer to you.
Sorry, there's a question. Before you address it, I know that Nina wanted to add something to that Jordan question. Nina?
Yeah, thanks so much. Hi, all. This is Nina Weisenhorn from USAID. I've been working a lot with Jim on this conflict sensitivity and conflict analysis work. And I think for the case of Jordan, and Jim started to touch on this at the end of his response, is that, we can use a general term like conflict analysis, but the way you communicate it, the way you convey what you're doing and why you're collecting information can be done in many ways. And I think also earlier Jim highlighted really well that conflict is always present in all of our lives. And so we can think about conflict with a big C, where there is active conflict, armed conflict, but there's also a little c conflicts that are happening in communities and in the places where we work. And we have conflict-affected populations living in places like Jordan. And so a conflict analysis needs to look at kind of both the big C conflict, but also be mindful and aware of little c conflicts that are interpersonal, intercommunal, and in order to be truly conflict sensitive, you have to be aware of where those tensions lie. And I think that in places like Jordan, it's really important to have your analyses happening at multiple levels so that you can take into account what could be triggers or risks in your programming and look at resilience factors to mitigate those. That's all I wanted to add.
Thanks, Nina. That's very good points. And to piggyback really quickly, it depends on like the scope of what you're looking at. Nina is exactly right. You can focus in down to the very local school refugee settlement level. If you want to look at Jordan as a country, I would say absolutely there should be another word, conflict analysis of Jordan, especially also because your conflict analysis can extend beyond borders. It is the nature of conflict, and it is being heavily influenced by conflict over its borders. And there are many arguments why this kind of an analysis is warranted in Jordan, and it does not mean that Jordan's going to slide into conflict. It can actually mean that if it is a Jordanian partner that you might be working with, the argument can be how can Jordan better handle and improve or find new opportunities in managing tensions across the border, managing how the regional conflict, which is that is now really a regional crisis, how it is affecting Jordanian institutions, partners, and what it can do from the appreciative inquiry standpoint, what it can do better. So all sorts of different arguments that you can use.
Thank you, Jim. And there are a couple of questions, one from Mina and one from Laura. If you can address those. Mina's question is, where in general do practitioners share the conflict analysis reports? Any most used websites? Sometimes you may need to get a quick look at conflict issues analyzed by somebody else, in particular from very challenging environment. Where to find these? Any recent on South Sudan, regarding education or in general. And then Laura's question, which is on the chat room, it's about the conflict analysis team. Describe, on slide 13, how can we tackle situations when your staff is limited? What are the minimum people one should consult with? Or what recommendations you can give for approaching colleagues outside your department? How can we convince people that this is important? And I think, yeah, can you address those, Jim? Good luck.
Yeah, two very good questions. I've lived them both pretty well. On the first question of where to find analyses, I would say two things you can do. There is no one-stop shop for them, neither globally nor at a country level necessarily. So, your Google searches. There is a South Sudan conflict analysis, conflict and education analysis that's on the ECCN site that UNICEF did maybe 2 years ago, maybe 3. That's a summary. But what I would do is network. Reach out to partners who tend to have those mandates and staff that do conflict analysis, and network around and ask people where if one has been recently done. South Sudan. And I don't know what organization you're with, but South Sudan has even despite the non-permissive environment and access issues, generally, you've got everybody who does anything on conflict, there or backstopping staff there one way or the other. And so from the UN mission to UNICEF, UNDP, lots of other, USAID partners, there's analysis that's being done and been done. So it's a little bit of networking, and I'm happy to try to help if you need for some suggestions. Like I said, I don't know which organization you're with, but I'm sure you're steeped with contacts. And I'm sorry, there's no easy good answer for that question. On the question of how can you pull together a team to do with under resource constraints, I guess, both in terms of human resources and I guess get institutional buy-in to do it. Some things come to mind. One is if you don't have conflict analysis or peace building expertise in-house, do reach out to partners. I've been involved in this in a number of countries, and where reach out to partners, because in general, if theoretically, any partner who's going to do a conflict analysis, let's say if it's going to be macro or if it's going to be a wide enough sample, a meaningful enough conflict analysis, you want it to be interagency anyway. You don't want theoretically, if I'm a national government, I don't want to have 35 conflict analyses at the same time. I would like to see some harmonization. I'd like to see partners coming together and getting as much of a convergence or consensus about the nature of conflict as possible. So reach out to partners with that expertise and see if you can pull them on board. I know that might involve other resource issues. I can't speak to that, but think of partners. The arguments to make to other offices doing a conflict analysis, there are many arguments that you can make. I tried to hit some of those arguments up front in the first couple of slides, and I would say that it's understanding context. If you are in a conflict-affected context, doing anything humanitarian, or whether you're doing development programming, there has to be some degree of conflict analysis. Otherwise, you will do harm. So it's easier to talk about conflict sensitivity and avoiding doing harm if you have sensitivity to the word conflict. There's other language you can use, but it is about quality programming. It is about doing no harm. If it's a humanitarian intervention, like I said, it is conflict sensitivity and not doing harm. And there is a way to even bring in a few questions into a humanitarian needs assessment if you need to find out more. But I would say that it is for achieving results. It is not a separate standalone kind of exercise. It is and should be integrated into all the design, analysis, and planning of all programs, because otherwise you're flying blind. And I can talk again bilaterally there too. I've been there. I have lots of scars from trying to do that. So, courage.
Great. I want to make sure that we don't miss a comment from Andrea. So this is an excellent presentation. In many ways, things are clearer. On the other hand, it still looks like a massive work to carry out a good enough education conflict analysis, but I look forward to reviewing your PowerPoint. So thank you, Andrea. And then a question from Anna. amazing presentation. Thank you. I was wondering what about your insights regarding including the results of a conflict analysis into school curriculums, how to deal with the different versions of a conflict and its causes. Does it work to include a variety of versions and stories, or build one, quote, official one that includes the experiences, the experience of the different stakeholders? How to use this as a tool for non-repetition of the conflict?
Yeah, forgive me, I'm taking a moment to read that one. It's a very important question, which moves away, if you would agree, it moves away from conflict analysis really into, gets into advocacy and advocacy and other dimensions of programming. But it's more of a peace building question. Gustavo, you were going to say something. I have this question in front of me from Ana, though.
Okay, great. Because there's another question about related to language by Andrea. Whether it should be my question is, what is or should be the criteria to choose a language in multilingual contexts? So if you want to address those two in like a couple of minutes, and then we'll just close.
Thanks. Sorry, can you still hear me?
Yes, we can.
Can you still hear me, Gustavo?
Yes.
Yes, Jim, you're good.
Okay. Let's see. I'm just confirming that my audio is still working. I'm not getting responses. Okay, good, thanks. Let's start with this, the peace building question. It goes a bit beyond analysis. And the question is, again, how to include results of conflict analysis in school curricula, how to deal with different versions of a conflict and its causes. You know, I hate to say it, I think that's going to be a longer conversation than what we have right here, but what you're talking about is how do you advocate for including conflict sensitivity, cohesion, peace building in a national curriculum? And I should state up front, I have not been on the front end of negotiating with the Ministry of Education about a national curriculum, and that can take a long time. But does it work to include a variety of versions and stories, or build one official one? I would think it depends. In general, and very theoretically, it is the different versions of history that actually do produce and continue to produce grievance. And theoretically, you know, evidence shows, and consider Bosnia, for instance. If you have three versions of history in the national curriculum, or three different national curricula, as the case may be with the entities in Bosnia, in three different versions of history, you're going to have three different communities and three different imagined communities. In the end, you do want to try to get to a point where you have one national version, but that is highly, highly political. And that really depends on the country context. It depends upon you know, a lot of other factors. And so I'm sorry, I'm not going to give a strong answer to that one right now. But I don't think you can, to use a conflict analysis tool for the non-repetition of the conflict, this may not help too much, but I'll offer this. Back to what I was saying about having multiple conflict analyses, it is helpful in general to have one overarching conflict analysis that involves a range of partners. That can be very, very helpful. That does not have to be sector specific. That could just focus on the conflict, but that is very helpful. And back in my UNICEF days, this was one of our key advocacy points, which was we never wanted to step forth and do a conflict analysis at the national level without partnership buy-in. By the nature of our mandate, but by the nature also of the UN country team and so forth. So you want to have one overarching understanding of the conflict, theoretically. So you can do a macro conflict analysis in that way, but there's a lot of political work to do to get the various important partners and stakeholders on board to get that done. And the other question was language. Question is, what should be the criteria to choose the language in multilingual contexts? Again, it's going to sound like, as we say in English, a fudge. It's really not a fudge. It's heavily locally determined. And this is where it's just very, very tricky. I would say it's a very locally determined decision, and again, very highly political. And I don't know, and I'm sure maybe some people on this call even, UNESCO's work or others might have some experience, some lessons to share. But I'm wondering if, this goes beyond conflict analysis, but I'm wondering if there might be some practice and some lessons that either UNESCO or even maybe UNICEF might be able to share. But I'm sorry, I can't give you a good answer there. I would just say it's very heavily locally driven.
Jim,
Great.
Thanks so much. We're about at our time for today. Marco already had another great comment that perhaps we can continue an offline discussion about. Thank you, everyone, for your active participation and attention.
Thank you very much. A very good question.
And thank you, Jim, so much.
Thank you very much. Gustavo, Natalie, thanks again for the opportunity. Take good care. Thank you. Good luck to all of you on your important work.
Thank you,
everybody, and stay tuned for more with the learning community. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Natalie, for all the help with the technical support.
Yes, thanks. Yep. And I will share Jim's PowerPoint with his permission today with all of our participants, and a link to this recording for you to refer to in the future.
Great. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.